Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for today's trade policy webinar. For those of you that may not know me, I'm Bobby Hanks from Supreme Rice Mill in Crowley, Louisiana. I currently serve as the USA Rice Federation Chairman and as the Chairman of the USA Rice International Trade Policy Committee. With more than 50% of our US rice crop exported every year, trade is vital to the industry. We manage the trade portfolio at USA Rice through the International Promotions and International Trade Policy Committees. We meet frequently to review our policies, discuss the status of ongoing trade negotiations, and provide direction for the staff to work on removing barriers to trade and on growing markets. We also have 2 points of access to federal trade policy through Dow Brantley, an Arkansas rice farmer who represents the rice industry by serving on the Agricultural Policy Advisory Committee, and Peter Bachman, who sits on the Agricultural Trade Advisory Committee for the grain sector. As you'll learn, a lot of the magic of trade policy happens behind the scenes, and so we have our friend and guest, Sharon Bomer, here today to give us a peek. Before Sharon gets started, I will turn it over to USA Rice President and CEO Betsy Ward to introduce her.
Thank you, Bobby, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I just want to mention that this webinar is being recorded and will be sent out via email tomorrow to all participants. And after the presentation concludes, we'll open it up for questions, and you can submit your questions through the chat function on Zoom. Very pleased to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Sharon Bomer. I've known Sharon for more than a decade through her work at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, or USTR. Sharon actually retired from USTR just about a year ago after more than 16 collective years there. Her career also included stints at USDA, Congress, and several private sector agricultural trade organizations, spanning more than 35 years of policy experience. As the highest ranking career negotiator for U.S. agriculture at USTR, Sharon was involved in nearly every major trade negotiations. And for rice, she led efforts to open rice markets, including the China Phytosanitary Agreement, USMCA negotiations, the Korea CSQ, Colombia TPA, and CAFTA DR agreement. Sharon really has first-hand experience working to pry open markets for U.S. rice and knows well how protected the world of rice is. Sharon was the recipient of our 2020 U.S. Rice Industry Award last year for her contributions to rice market access. And I just think we're so fortunate to have this opportunity for a one-on-one dialogue with someone who has such insight and historical information about trade policy. As we enter a new administration with new trade policy objectives, we thought it would benefit all of us to hear from someone who is recognized as such an expert on all things trade and who can give us an insider's view of how the complex world of trade negotiations work. So with that, I'll say thank you very much, Sharon, for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Bessie, and it is certainly a pleasure to be with all of you today. I'll note that on the Korea agreement, I was looking at that before today's session, and I see that we exported over an increase of 35% over 2020, and that's a 35% increase over 200,000 metric tons. So that really seems to me to be something that's very positive. And I'm sorry, I'm having struggled with my screen. It's not moving. We're going to try the screen share again. Just give me a minute. Okay, there we go. So sorry about that. So as Betsy and Bobby said, this is intended to be a sort of trade policy 101. Some of you are extremely experienced. Hopefully I'll provide some new information for you as to how the US government develops trade policy and the role for all of you in helping to shape that policy going forward. I'll set the table with talking a little bit about how important trade is to US agriculture, touch on the policy development mechanics, both the role of Congress, the role of the executive branch, then talk about how farmers in the private sector can weigh in, then talk about sort of the components of trade policy. So what are the different forms of trade agreements? And then some of the key substance. And then I'll end with sort of looking forward on what are the key challenges that I see US agriculture needing to pay attention to. We will then have lots of time for questions, comments, and discussion. So let's set the table. There's always a metaphor in everything we say about agriculture. So I like to say setting the table. And I know you know, but just so you see the broader picture, this is a slide of both exports and imports over the past 10 years for agricultural products with the United States. And 2019 was a really unusual year because that's the first year where imports actually edged out and were higher than the amount that we exported. That shifted back in 2020 with the opening of the China market. So in 2020, we exported about $150 billion and imported approximately $146 billion. As you know, exports are really important to our farmers. This is a slide that I stole, but giving credit to USDA. They presented it in their Outlook conference a couple of weeks ago. But it shows for the different commodities, the percent of ag exports as a percent of production. I've highlighted rice there at 51%. And that's a really high number. And so that's why in the US government, we pay so much attention to exports and trying to find and open up new markets. Here's a couple of slides on rice specific that many of you already know about. On the left is the value of rice exports, which are in green, and then compared to the rice import value, which is in blue over the past 20 years. And generally, looking at the slope, there's a steady trend up. But if you do look at the volume, it's a slightly different story on the right, where you have a 20-year trend on the exports that actually is with some ups and downs, but is relatively flat. We have seen an uptick on imports over the past 20 years, but as a percent of the US market, it is only about 11 to 14%, depending on the year. That increase in imports tends to be in the aromatic varieties, which I'm sure many of you know. All right, so now let's talk about trade policy development. And I want to start with the US Congress because it is in the US Constitution that gives the US Congress sole authority to levy or to apply tariffs for imports into the United States and to regulate foreign commerce. And a little bit of history for 145 years at the beginning of our country, Congress exercised that authority directly by setting tariffs. And that policy changed in 1934 when Congress delegated authority to the President of the United States to enter into reciprocal trade agreements that reduced tariffs within a pre-approved levels and did not require any further congressional action. And then in the 1960s, non-tariff barriers became a topic of trade negotiations. So Congress found it necessary to alter the delegation of that tariff authority to require implementing legislation to authorize changes in US law, US tariffs necessary to meet those new obligations. But given an implementing bill could face possible amendment by currently now 535 different members of Congress, that could alter a long negotiated agreement. Countries were reticent in having to negotiate with the United States. So Congress adopted in 1974 what we now know as Trade Promotion Authority. And that provides for expedited legislative consideration for certain trade agreements negotiated by the executive branch. The most recent version of Trade Promotion Authority, or I will call it TPA because everything in Washington has an acronym, passed in 2015, and it expires on June 30th of this year. And it has four main pieces. One, it defines trade agreement policy priorities by specifying US negotiating objectives. As the negotiator, I paid a great deal of attention to multiple pages of agriculture negotiating objectives, and I can assure you there are more negotiating objectives for agriculture than any other sector of the US economy. The second piece was to ensure that the executive branch advanced those objectives through various notification and consultation requirements with Congress, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. The third piece was it defined the terms, conditions, and procedures under which the president may enter into trade agreements to determine which bill, which legislation may be approved under expedited authority, which is a yes or no, up or down vote. And then the fourth is important to Congress. The legislation reaffirms the constitutional authority of Congress over trade policy by placing limitations on how TPA can be used. But what does this mean in practice? Well, it means the executive branch, which is led by the US Trade Representative's Office, which is an agency of the Executive Office of the President, they negotiate the trade agreements, but they do it under the oversight of Congress. TPA requires that the executive branch consult with Congress before, during, and after a negotiation for those negotiations that will require that up or down vote by Congress. So you may have heard complaints from some in Congress lately that the last administration did not consult enough. And so when Congress takes up consideration of a new TPA bill, possibly this year, but that may be deferred, I do expect that that consultation mechanism in the legislation will be significantly strengthened. The consultations that the executive branch has are generally with the House of Representatives Ways and Means Committee, which is responsible for tax and tariffs, and with the Senate Finance Committee. But in the case of agriculture, TPA also requires that the House and Senate Agriculture Committees be consulted. And US Department of Agriculture staff, USDA staff always joins USTR for briefings with the Congressional Agriculture Committees. Many of the consultations are handled at the staff level, people like me, but the past couple of statutes, trade promotion authorities, has also established House and Senate committees of actual members of Congress with which the US Trade Representative at the cabinet level consults. Now, these TPA procedures, however, don't cover all trade agreements. And as some examples, the US-China agreement that many of you know was not covered by TPA because there was nothing in it that touched on the application or changing of US tariffs. And remember, Congress has the authority on tariffs. So if an agreement, though, isn't going to change US tariffs, the executive branch has argued that it does not need to consult with Congress. The US-Japan agreement was slightly different because it did change certain US industrial tariffs, but it was exempted from all of those TPA procedures or a congressional vote. And that's because the current statute has a provision that says that the executive branch has authority to negotiate on US tariffs that are smaller than 5%. Or they can negotiate on higher tariffs, but they can only agree to cut those higher tariffs by 50%. So it's very limited. And important for US agriculture, the statute has a provision that the administration The executive branch cannot negotiate on any tariffs for import sensitive agricultural products. And it was those constraints that in part limited the scope of the US-Japan agreement so that the last administration would not have to present this agreement for a vote in Congress. There are also regulatory agreements and trade agreements that don't touch US tariffs that aren't covered. And the US-Korea rice deal fell into that bucket. Anyway, these consultations enable Congress to provide the oversight, with the intent being with sufficient oversight. And when the negotiations are finished and the executive branch passes the treaty to Congress, Congress can more easily vote on the agreement without amendment and a simple yes or no. So then we move to the executive branch and their responsibilities. So the US Trade Representative is responsible for leading the development of US trade policy. They're the leads on negotiating the trade agreements. They're responsible enforcement of trade agreements. And what many people don't realize, USTR also advises on US compliance with trade agreements. And this primarily comes through a process where USTR staff will review proposed regulations, draft regulations, in the case of agriculture, phytosanitary decisions, food safety regulations, to make sure that the United States will be issuing a final regulation that's in compliance with our international agreements. And as US government agencies go, USTR is a relatively small one. There's approximately only 220 staff. And so it's important to understand that everything that USTR done is really done on an interagency basis. We have a somewhat bureaucratic structure. It's called the Trade Policy Staff Committee, where every government agency gets to sit around the table and comment on, review, but in essence, we need consensus to move forward on a policy decision, on trade text that we're going to be tabling in a negotiation, proposals for how we might agree to lower or phase out US tariffs. So that's all done through this Trade Policy Staff Committee. If there is not an agreement at that committee level, again, that committee is generally was at the level that I was at, so senior career staff, it will be moved up to a higher level decision group, and that's a sub-cabinet political level called the Trade Policy Review Group. If there's no agreement there, it goes to the cabinet. If there's no agreement there, then it goes to the president. Now, that being said, the last administration did not use the TPSC process like other administrations. A lot of the decisions were made at the top and then filtered down. But I'll say even the Obama administration moved some of the decision making into the White House through the National Security Council and the National Economic Council, rather than having a fulsome and wholesome TPSC process. In the case of agriculture negotiations, USDA is a close partner with the USTR Office of Agricultural Affairs that I headed up in making decisions on agriculture, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, or other technical regulations. And as a negotiator, I made sure that USDA was sitting next to me in all negotiations. USTR's Agriculture Affairs Office only has about 12 people to cover the world. And USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service obviously has hundreds around the world that have the knowledge and the expertise to conduct the detailed analysis and advice that negotiators need. So what is your role, the role of farmers in the private sector? And this is critical for negotiators at USTR to have this. And you know, the advice of USDA is only one small part. In 1974, Congress established what's called the Trade Advisory Committee System. And as Bobby said, the rice industry has representatives on a couple of the agriculture committees that draw out from that. USTR, the Department of Agriculture, the Commerce, the secretaries appoint these private sector advisors to provide advice. And that's sometimes misunderstood. Some advisors think they tell the negotiators what to do, but it's an advisory role. There are now well over 200 agriculture advisors. They do have government security clearances due to the sensitive nature of some of the information shared with them. Generally, negotiators don't want their negotiating strategies made public because that undermines their ability at the negotiating table. But it is critical to have advice from industry in making those decisions. The advisory committees will see all initial negotiating proposals for a trade agreement and provide comments and views on text. They also will see the initial proposal the US would make on any tariff negotiation. And they're briefed frequently, but they don't always see text during the negotiations. And I have found advisors most helpful when we as the negotiators had to make the difficult decisions near the end of negotiations. So for example, in the negotiations we had with South Korea on rice, I regularly consulted with the rice industry because I wanted to make sure that whatever we agreed to would be acceptable to the rice industry. What good is a negotiation if you're not doing what is sought for by your stakeholders? And there's also a role for trade association and individual farmers to weigh in outside of this advisory committee system. So whenever you have fly-ins, whenever you are traveling to Washington, D.C. on family trips or whatever it might be, meeting with USTR and USDA staff is really important to make sure that those of us who live inside the Washington Beltway know what's going on outside of the Beltway. Congressional members also obviously seek input from their constituents, and members of Congress use that in communicating with the executive branch. So I always knew that even though I was briefing an advisory committee, in a matter of days, we would likely get inquiries from Congress on the same questions because it really is a closed loop. If a member of Congress knows what they're doing, it's a closed loop to make sure everybody's going to be on the same page. But it's important not just for us to know what's going on in the United States, but the market information that organizations like USA Rice have of what's going on in the foreign market is really critical information for the government negotiators to know. So what are the components of agricultural trade policy? First, I'll talk about some of the substance, the actual fora. There are many different types of agreements. I touched on it briefly earlier. There are issue-specific agreements. So the US-Korea Rice Agreement falls into that category. And it actually includes multiple pieces. One part of the agreement is signed by 7 countries that got country-specific quotas as a part of that. But that wasn't enough for the United States because of all the problems we had in the Korean market before. We have a separate bilateral agreement with South Korea on consultations and communications. There's an understanding on access for table rice. So we went one beyond that one agreement that actually carved up the quota among countries. There's also then bilateral agreements, and there's different kinds here again. So the US-Mexico-Canada agreement and the Central America Free Trade Agreement, those are what we call as comprehensive trade agreements. They cover all tariffs. They cover sanitary and phytosanitary measures. It covers, the newer ones cover e-commerce, intellectual property. They really set rules. There's dispute settlement options in there. And then there are agreements like the US-Japan agreement that I already described. That's viewed as a phase 1 to a future comprehensive agreement because there are certain WTO rules about how we need to approach that. US-China is a standalone bilateral. It has its own enforcement mechanism. And we have about 21 countries where we have those comprehensive trade agreements, but we also have these things called trade and investment framework agreements. And we have, the United States has over 55 of these. The acronym is TIFA. And they're important because they provide a formal mechanism whereby the United States sits down with its trading partner to talk about any specific problems. So as an industry, as you look at problems you may be having in other countries, just because we don't have one of these comprehensive agreements doesn't mean there's not a forum and a mechanism for you to be weighing in on agendas and how to approach certain issues. We then have what are called the multilateral agreements, and the World Trade Organization agreement that was implemented in 1995 is probably the most important of that. It establishes tariffs that countries can apply on what's called the most favored nation basis. For the United States, those are our actual tariffs. Some countries will apply tariffs lower than what they've agreed to at the WTO. It's also the WTO where we would negotiate any domestic support. That's our trade word for the farm support, farm subsidies, ARC program, PLC, et cetera. And it has a dispute settlement mechanism, which has gotten a lot of attention lately. There's a structure within the WTO where we have regular conversations on agriculture issues, particularly domestic support and tariffs. So this is the Committee on Agriculture is where we would ask innumerable questions of India on its domestic support programs. There are committees on food safety and phytosanitary measures, but there's also negotiation, loosely termed negotiations on agriculture. A lot of countries want to try and negotiate a reduction in developed countries' domestic support. So we tend to be defensive in those negotiations as well. But there's other multilateral organizations. The United Nations is one. There's going to be a lot of attention there this year with the United Nations holding a food systems summit. There's a lot of concern in U.S. agriculture about what may try to be done there to undermine animal agriculture or pesticide use. I put the Codex Alimentarius Commission here as well. The Codex is the international standard setting organization for food safety. It is tied to World Trade Organization trade obligations. And so the United States has a very vocal position that countries should follow Codex food safety standards if they want to be consistent with their WTO obligations. The International Plant Protection Convention, that's the Phytosanitary International Standards Organization. So that's also multilateral. But you'll also hear people talk about plurilateral. And there are several organizations around the world that are many countries, but it's a limited membership. Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is really a home for developed countries to do research and have conversations. The Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, that's the Asia Pacific countries. There's a lot of training that we do there, but we use it sort of as an incubator for new ideas or policy ideas to see if other countries want to take approaches. You then have things, the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, we know that is TPP. That would be considered a plurilateral. And now we have a new plurilateral, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is stepsister at best to TPP, but includes China. So then what I'll call the substance, and there's really sort of 6 buckets of issues that we pay attention to in negotiations. And the first is domestic support. So that's farm support, that's the subsidies that countries give to their farmers, whether it's emergency assistance, disaster assistance. Countries like India have a lot of farm support through their market price policies. In the United States, the last US notification that we gave to the WTO, we only had about $65 million of trade distorting support for US rice. That's what we consider to be a de minimis level, so it doesn't really get counted against anything. The second bucket is tariffs. And frequently you'll hear negotiators talk about market access. So market access is our shorthand for talking about tariffs and what the levels of tariffs are, as well as for tariff rate quotas. You then have export competition as a third bucket. Countries in the WTO have already agreed to eliminate export subsidies, which the United States does not have anymore anyway. But this also includes USDA export credits and food aid. And we still have other countries that don't like how the United States uses those two programs, but it is one so that we tend to be a bit defensive on those. This also includes a new issue that we have focused on as a result of the pandemic, and that's export restrictions. The United States has joined a number of countries to get countries to agree not to have export restrictions. And there was large support for that. This is particularly, though, we narrowed it even further to try and get consensus. So not to have any export restrictions on purchases made by the World Food Program for humanitarian purposes. Unfortunately, India blocked that, but work continues to try and get support for that. The next bucket is sanitary and food phytosanitary measures. The shorthand is SPS, so that's all food safety, animal health and plant health, basic obligations, science-based, risk-based decisions, not more trade restrictive than necessary. But it's important to understand it's the importing country that gets to decide the level of the measure. So it was felt back in the 90s, and I would argue it's still important that the importing country needs to decide and have the sovereign right to decide what makes food safe, what protects animals from foreign pests and disease, what protects plants. Pesticide maximum residue levels fall into this category, so that's a very important issue these days as well. And I also want you to be aware other countries don't like what the United States does in SPS. So this isn't just about us trying to break down these barriers in export markets. The United States is frequently asked to make changes in our measures as well. Then you have technical barriers to trade, and I like to simplify this. This is regulations that are not in the SPS bucket. So things like labeling, certification fall into this category. And then the last piece is enforcement, because you can't have a trade agreement if you don't enforce it. And people tend to think of very formal dispute settlement provisions. There's a lot of attention to what's going on or not going on right now at the World Trade Organization on enforcement. But I'd like to look at enforcement more broadly. There's the day-to-day issues that occur, containers being held at a point of import in a foreign port. We have USDA Foreign Ag Service people all over the world. This is, their bread and butter is to try and deal with all of these day-to-day problems, dealing with individual shipments or particular commodities. Then there's the bucket of technical issues that USDA and the Food and Drug Administration would tackle. And in this case, USTR probably won't get involved in them because they may be truly technical. It may be a real plant health issue. It may be a real food safety issue. And it's important for it really to be dealt with by the regulatory and scientific experts in those agencies. This is also at USDA, where there's going to be a lot of tracking of information on how tariff rate quotas are administered by other countries, making sure that those countries are not blocking imports through ways of administering those TRQs. So that's where that falls. The next group is what I call the political issues. And so that's generally when USTR would get involved. And USTR would get involved if asked by USDA or FDA or the Environmental Protection Agency, or if industry is frustrated enough that progress is not being made at a technical level, industry may come to USTR and say, please get involved. So these are things, I would say the recent ones of interest are the actions that the European Union is taking on pesticide maximum levels. It's the India domestic support measures USTR and USDA did a lot of work to try and bring some transparency to how extensive their domestic support was, and with impacts on global markets. And more recently, we've got these issues with Mexico, for example. It's put a ban on glyphosate, which obviously hurts their farmers, and they're not approving biotechnology products as well. And then you have the formal dispute mechanism through the World Trade Organization, but the bilateral agreements, USMCA, also have a formal dispute, and this is when lawyers get involved. So the dispute we had with China over its rice tariff rate quota and domestic support falls in this bucket. The last administration initiated bilateral dispute against Canada on how it was administering its dairy tariff rate quotas. We have long-standing issues with the European Union on biotechnology, but there's lots of problems with using these formal dispute. One of those being insufficient resources, in my opinion, at USTR, legal resources, because every time the United States takes a dispute against a country, lo and behold, that country will likely file a dispute against the United States. So there's really a lot of legal resources at USTR that goes into these formal process. Overarching, what's important to remember is each issue is really going to be handled differently and will depend on the country. It'll depend on the problem. It depends on how we think the most effective way of getting resolution is. Sometimes disputes are taken like EU biotech, not because we thought the European Union would ever make changes, but we wanted to make sure that other countries saw what we were doing so that they would not do the same thing as the European Union. So for the last slide, we'll talk about some of the key challenges I see going forward. Some of these are old, some of them will always be there. And that sort of is the first group. As a negotiator, it's always hard to balance the export and the import issues. You know, when we negotiate, the US always focuses on expanding agricultural export access. We are a huge powerhouse when it comes to agricultural exports. And as that early slides show, it's important for our farmers that we continue to open our markets. But as in any negotiation, as you know in your business, the United States wants something, the other country wants something in return. So, you know, we in TPP negotiations, we wanted access for US rice into Japan. And rice is a highly politically sensitive issue in Japan. And I'll say ag issues are, and farmers are politically sensitive issues for every single country of the world. So it's not necessarily unique. But to sit down to talk with the United States, Japan on rice, Japan needed some political cover, obviously. So, you know, it was seeking elimination of US automotive tariffs. Well, automotive tariffs are sensitive to the United States. These are the types of issues that go to cabinet level or to the president. Another example is US ethanol producers were seeking that Brazil lower its ethanol tariffs. But corn ethanol, which is what we produce, competes against Brazil's production of sugar ethanol. And sugar producers in Brazil are a very powerful political lobby. Therefore, Brazil said, well, if you want us to lower our corn ethanol tariffs, then we want access to the US market for your sugar market. Well, the US has a highly protected sugar market. And sugar is very politically sensitive, and the US has a very powerful sugar lobby. So these are the types of very hard political decisions that go into any negotiation. But it's also why it's important for the administration to be consulting with stakeholders and to be able to consult with Congress to try and see if the middle ground can be had. I put the next one because the last administration spent a lot of time focusing on developing versus developed, especially at the World Trade Organization. And then there's issues of large versus small countries. The United States is a very large, wealthy country, and we have a very attractive market, obviously, for a lot of countries. Kenya, for example, is not. So, should we have the same negotiating objectives for a developing country like Kenya as we would for when we're trying to reach an agreement with the United Kingdom, which is a developed country? Those are, again, why trade agreements may look different in the end. And then, so what is science? Everyone, especially with the pandemic, people are paying more attention to science. Well, science really isn't black and white. Plus the number of barriers that are increasing around the world using food safety or plant health is increasing. So the United States has been approaching this saying, listen, we need the international standards. Countries should follow international standards. But again, the science is not always black and white. Transparency, and there's really two buckets of transparency here I wanted to highlight. One is getting other countries to be transparent on their policies, and the United States has spent a lot of time, particularly at the World Trade Organization over the past few years, trying to get countries to improve notifying for example, their domestic support programs. But there's also an issue of transparency in a negotiation. How much information should be made public or told to stakeholders, told to advisors, told to Congress? I personally think we could be doing a much better job of being transparent in what we're doing as negotiators. And hopefully that then helps develop more support for trade. The next one I want to highlight too, because I think it does have an impact on agriculture, and that's U.S. industrial policy. We saw the last administration really prioritize U.S. industrial policy and take a lot of actions to protect and try and promote stronger, I'll call it heavy manufacturing in the United States. And so when countries are focused on an industrial policy, that deprioritize possibly what you can get on agriculture. So it's something to pay attention to, and how the new administration balances industrial policy with agricultural policy. Other countries' trade agendas is always hard, and the European Union is the poster child on this. They have a very long-term view of what they're going to include in trade agreements. One of the most notable is how they get other countries to adopt geographical indications, which frequently infringes on US market access, for example, for cheese or wine in third countries. And now the European Union has been very public that they're going to sell its farm to fork policy in other countries. That calls for cutting pesticide use, cutting fertilizer use. So what does that, we don't know yet what that will mean for the United States, but certainly is something that's being paid attention to. And then I have here a whole list of newer issues for agriculture, and I don't want to in any way underestimate. I think a lot of attention needs to be paid by US agriculture to sustainability and climate change. How do we incorporate some of these into trade agreements? I do think the new administration is going to focus on these. There's also the anti-dumping and countervailing duty. The past several years, US agricultural exporters have really been hit hard by these additional duties being placed on our exports. But at the same time, there's a balance, because we also apply here in the United States anti-dumping and CVD countervailing duties on imports into the United States if they're traded unfairly. So, again, is there a better way to be doing this? That may be something that should be looked at. The new expected USTR, Catherine Tai, has made it very clear that she's going to focus on labor and environment. I was pleased to hear her say quite plainly that farmers and ranchers she considers to be workers and part of the labor force. So that's an important message for all of us to know. We then have these new technologies. The US government has spent a lot of time, and you guys experienced it big time in 2011 when you had an unapproved biotech event in the rice shipments. But now we're looking at the regulation of gene editing, or maybe the non-regulation of gene editing. So as all these new technologies come on board, how do we deal with them in the international trade realm? I think that's going to be important. And then I put in consumer preferences are having a bigger role. And we're seeing this, for example, on food labeling and processed food labeling. A lot of countries, it started in Chile, I think in 2012 or so, they're now putting stop signs on foods that are high in sugar, fat, and sodium. So that has a real impact on a lot of the products that US companies manufacture. So again, these are just issues to be thinking about. There's always going to be new ones. And I think that concludes my remarks. So we can open it up for comments or questions, discussion.
Thank you, Sharon. I think that was a lot of very helpful information for everybody. I certainly learned a few things in there, and I hope everybody participating did as well. At this time, I think you can go ahead and submit questions through the Q&A chat function at the bottom of the screen, and we will go through and read out questions as they come in. But just to get things started, Sharon, I'll give you one to kick it off. And so while the US and USA Rice are obviously appreciative of all of the efforts to address the subsidies in the TRQ administration issues in China, it's been 5 years since the paperwork was filed and we have not yet retaliated. Do you foresee or predict that we'll be in a position where we can retaliate, and how long do you think that'll take at this point? And is the process always this long, or is there a faster route to address bad actors in the future?
Yeah, good question, Peter. And those questions are why we generally look at WTO dispute settlement as a last resort. I hope there's no lawyers on the call. It is controlled by lawyers, and it is a very long process. There are procedures for hearings in person, submission of briefs. You then have a panel that will issue a report that can be hundreds of pages long. You have an opportunity to challenge factual pieces within that report. And then if a country loses, like China lost, there's then a negotiation to say, okay, how much time, China, do you need to make the changes to come into compliance? In the case of those two cases, I believe we gave them 12 months, which is standard. That's a full year, right? So that's another year. And then, countries have the right to appeal. Now, we were fortunate. We used our negotiations on the US-China phase 1 deal to get China to not appeal those two cases. But if you've got an appeal that's also tacked onto that, that's another couple of years. And so then there's even more legal proceedings. So, the year of coming into compliance comes up, and the United States, for example, will say, we don't think you're in compliance yet. Or in the case, quite frankly, of these two cases, there's still a lot of data that you need to collect data. You have to watch what's going on to determine whether China's filling the TRQ or not. What are they doing in their farm programs? But let's say the United States decides that China's not in compliance. Well, then you go back to the lawyers and you say, okay, they're not in compliance. And you have to wait for the WTO again over many months to say, yep, we agree with you, the United States, they're not in compliance. All right, so then we have an agreement that they're not in compliance. All right, then we say, okay, we're ready to retaliate. Well, you have to go back to the WTO and you argue on what is the value of the retaliation going to be. And that's more legal proceedings. So it is a very long process. If you look at the European Union US dispute on Airbus and Boeing subsidies, that's been going on for 12 or 14 years. And it was only this past year when both countries started retaliating against each other with additional duties. So I don't think it's long. It's for last resort. Is there some way to get it faster? Well, right, and that's where reform comes in. And I think it will remain to be seen whether any country is willing to fully reform this dispute settlement process to make it more effective. Because again, the lawyers control it, and the lawyers want to make sure they have all their bases covered and they have all their arguments, et cetera, et cetera. It's not unlike the US court system in that respect, where it can take a long time. But I think there are mechanisms that could be done to streamline.
Good, thank you. Here's our next question from a participant, and it says, thank you, Sharon. Regarding the Japan trade agreement under the current administration, do you feel that they will prioritize revisiting entering the CTPPP or starting a bilateral discussion with Japan?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one that I've been trying to pay attention to. I don't think it'll be near term. I don't think they're going to focus on it in the next year or two. The president's been very clear. He wants to focus on pandemic and domestic recovery. I do think there's an opportunity, and Catherine Tai didn't close the door on it when she was asked about this at her hearing. But it's worth noting that we're not in the same place in the United States on trade policy now as we were 6 years ago when we negotiated TPP. So I wouldn't be surprised that once, if the United States does decide that it wants to rejoin TPP, that they're going to insist on some negotiations to make some changes. I'm not sure how the other TPP partners will feel about that, right? They really felt burned when the United States dropped out of TPP in 2017. So there may be a lack of trust. So we may need to look at maybe doing some baby steps with some smaller pieces to try and regain the trust. But I know there's a lot of interest on industry in the private sector side to try and rejoin, but I think it will require some changes.
Thank you. Here's the next question, and it's, what is your feeling on the progress of the current relationship between the US government and China? Do you think there is any strengthening of the relationship under this new administration, or will human rights and other issues continue to cause reluctance to engage in more favorable relations?
Another really good question. As we know, the administration says that they're doing a comprehensive review. Certainly what I'm picking up is there's a recognition that maybe the US-China trade relationship is a different silo than the human rights issues, the Hong Kong issue, the Taiwan issue. So I think at this point, we're going to have to see what happens. But I expect that there will be many voices, particularly from the industry, to keep the trade piece siloed and try and keep that on a positive and constructive direction.
Great, thank you. Here's another question, and why is rice considered such a sensitive commodity in international trade negotiations? And are other commodities as equally or more sensitive than rice that you've dealt with?
Yeah, well, I think I said in my comments, every country is going to protect their farmers. And, rice is a sensitive commodity when you have rice farmers. So one of the great things about negotiating with the United Kingdom is they don't have rice farmers. So, that should be an easy one. Negotiating with Japan. What?
I was saying it should be an easy one in theory. Yeah.
In theory, right? Negotiator has good arguments to make, at least. Japan, Thailand, Indonesia, all of those countries. It's just a politically important group. But there are other commodities and products that are import sensitive. In the United States, I'd have to say that sugar is probably the most import sensitive commodity, and it's also very politically powerful. Dairy has been known to be import sensitive. They've changed over the past, I would say, 10 years as they've focused more on export markets. Orange juice is import sensitive for the United States. We have Florida producers of fruits and vegetables who are having a terrible time with the level of import, even counter seasonal imports and product from Mexico coming in. So the United States does have a lot of import sensitive, and that's what makes a difficult negotiation is when another country wants access for your politically sensitive products and you want access to their politically sensitive products.
That makes sense. Thank you. Here's another one. A lot of our members actually have interest in exporting to the EU, or they have longstanding markets there. Do you think there will be any sort of comprehensive trade deal with the EU in the next 5 to 10 years, something similar to like what we saw pop up with TTIP over the last 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I remember in 2011 or 12, when we started talking about trying to do a negotiation with Europe, there were individuals in USTR saying, listen, we tried this 10 years ago. It's not going to go anywhere. Let's put it this way. I wouldn't bet any of my own personal money on getting a comprehensive deal with Europe. We're both extremely large markets. We have our own ways of doing things, and they are not the same. While I think it is intriguing possibility, I would put it in the less than 50-50 bucket.
Got it. Well, that's unfortunate, but we're not surprised by that. Here's another one. We're interested in upping our sales to Africa, and Kenya in particular imports a lot of rice, but they've got a 35% tariff in effect for U.S. rice imports. And do you see a trade deal wrapping up with Kenya in the next year? Is that something that's going to be prioritized during this administration like it was with the last?
Yeah. So the administration hasn't pontificated yet on the Kenyan negotiations, but I do see this as an opportunity and something that they're going to want to pursue. There is an interest in focusing on Kenya and doing a trade negotiation with Kenya. I think is a good way forward. I don't think it'll be finished this year. I expect that it could take a couple of years to do. And one of the things I think that will be different about it is, the United States will be doing a lot of thinking of how can they provide capacity building and training and, financial support to Kenya, because that's going to be important for them if we're going to insist, for example, that they base their phytosanitary measures on science. We need to make sure they've got the infrastructure to be able to do that, for example. So I think it'll be a slightly different negotiation than the one with the United Kingdom. But I do expect that the administration will pick it back up.
That's good to hear. Thank you. Here's another question from a participant, and they asked, what do you think will happen with the U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum and subsequent retaliatory tariffs on our products? And I guess that goes for China, but also for the other countries as well. And rice is impacted in Turkey, in the Europe and the UK, as well as China.
Yeah. Again, I think another really good question, and I don't think we have any clear insights into how the new administration is going to approach it. I think there is a recognition within people in the new administration that the tariff approach is not necessarily the most effective approach to deal with the overcapacity production of aluminum and steel globally, and particularly out of China. So I do expect them to try and tackle this. It may not be in the first 6 months. It may not even be in the first year. But I do hope that they do tackle it. Again, American farmers were hit hard on this, not just by the retaliatory tariffs, but by the price of steel for, that they use on their farms, so and production of cans and food goods. I mean, it was just the number of complaints that we heard at USTR when I was there was really heart-renting. So again, I think we're going to have to live with them for a while longer, but I'm optimistic that this administration will eventually be looking at it and seeing if there's a different approach.
Good to hear. And I saw this morning that the UK and the US suspended their tariffs on the Airbus and Boeing, which fortunately, Rice was not caught up in that dispute. But, we would love to see the tariffs on steel and aluminum suspended or removed completely with the UK and with the EU. So
right.
We won't hold our breath, but we will be optimistic. Here's another question. Do you see the administration taking a strong offensive tone against bad actors like India? One thing that the rice industry, like you mentioned, we've got a lot of issues with how India treats their farmers, and they're over subsidizing and potentially providing export subsidies, and we are really interested in taking offensive action there. Is there a path this administration or in the next year to see something like that happen?
Yeah, and when I was at USTR, we worked a lot and closely with you all and corn and wheat to analyze and bring some light to the extensive nature of India's market price support programs and the trade distorting effect that they had. Again, I think this will be, I think USTR and this administration will be careful in moving too fast on initiating disputes. I think a lot will, in this case, depend on what their foreign policy relationship with India will be. India is a very important national security partner of the United States. India has millions and millions of farmers, and many of them impoverished. So I don't know if that will impact decisions. But if the U.S. agriculture industry, the rice, the wheat, corn, there are, something like 12 different commodities that are impacted by market price support. If they want to go the route of pursuing a WTO dispute, which will last years, I think they're going to have to really be vocal advocates for the farmers, our farmers.
Understood. Thank you. And we have time for 2 or 3 more questions if folks want to continue submitting those. But next up, I'll ask if you think that we'll have trade deals go anywhere this year if trade promotion, if TPA is not in effect.
Yeah.
And that's something that, it expires June 30th, you mentioned, but all trade deals under TPA have to be introduced by April 1st to the US Congress. Is that correct? And so
to be covered by the current statute, right?
So what happens then if it doesn't get renewed quickly or at all?
Yeah. No, I expect TPA to be renewed and to be reauthorized. I will be very surprised if it's reauthorized by July 1. So I do expect it to lapse. That doesn't mean that the UK negotiations and the Kenya negotiations can't continue. There are mechanisms in place, just like we did for TPP, where you can continue to negotiate. And there are elements included in the reauthorization statute to cover those agreements. So there is a way to do this. But if you don't have TPA, other countries aren't necessarily going to want to sign up to have a trade negotiation with the United States. Now, there are lots of things that trade negotiators do before you formally announce that you're going to be negotiating. There's a lot of groundwork that is done. You do a lot of education and asking questions and scoping, et cetera, to determine whether or not you think a negotiation can actually be successful. So there's plenty of work that USTR could do while Congress works on reauthorizing TPA. In addition, I think Congress is going to make changes to TPA, as I mentioned. There are many on Capitol Hill that did not think that more consultations are needed during trade negotiations and on different trade issues, such as the US-Japan agreement. So I think you'll see some changes in the actual statute that will have to be worked through, and some of them could be substantive. So that's why I think it'll take longer.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's reassuring that you're optimistic it'll be reauthorized this year, and we will certainly make that one of our legislative priorities as, you know, our piece of the broader agricultural coalitions that are pushing for TPA.
It may be next year. I didn't think I said this year, but it may not happen until next year.
Okay. Here's another question from a participant, and it's do you think genes modified with CRISPR will be classified as GMO in any international markets? And how do you think the US will classify this technology?
Yeah, good one. You know, I think USDA did a lot over the past couple of years to really signal that they're not going to be regulating CRISPR gene editing like what I would call the traditional rDNA biotechnology. And we're seeing other countries take similar approaches. Japan's doing consultations now. Even Europe is trying to figure out how does it get out of the mess that it's in on gene editing. So I'm really quite optimistic that countries will see the benefits to the technology and hopefully, cross fingers, have rational regulatory policy going forward on it.
Thank you. And this will be our last question before we wrap up, but how can rice better position itself, in your opinion, to make progress in future trade agreements? And could our advanced sustainability efforts help leverage access when working in markets where that's important?
Yeah. Well, I'll first say I think USA Rice already does a good job of engaging with the US government and negotiators on an ongoing basis on the trade issues. So having that presence and doing fly-ins when fly-ins can start again, et cetera, you know, that's all an important part of that to make sure people know to call you and to listen, et cetera. So I think you already do a good job. But I do agree that sustainability is going to be the watchword. I think that's going to be important for this administration. American agriculture is great at sustainability. We don't get the credit that we should. And I know there's a lot of efforts going on right now to try and do some positive messaging on that. Same with climate change. You know, I think our farmers are doing really a lot of good work. And I know there's a lot of interest in more research in that area. So I do think those are two things that industry needs to think about. How would you incorporate elements of those into a trade agreement, if it should be at all, I think is also a question. But the European Union is way out in front of everybody on this one. And so there's an issue of either catching up or doing an end run, or somehow I think we're going to need to address it.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate all your time today, and so do the rest of our staff and our members and leadership. And thank you for taking the time out of your day, and thank you to all the participants that joined in today. And as we noted, this was recorded and will be available later on for viewing for folks that missed it or want to go back and review something. And in the meantime, we will stay in touch with you, Sharon, and good luck in the private sector. We're looking forward to continuing working with you there.
Great. Thanks so much, Peter, Bobby, Betsy. Always enjoy working with you.
Thank you.